Welcome to JM690B, Strategic Planning, bridging the gap between theory and practice, an evidence-based approach to strategic planning. There are many goals associated with this class, and those goals tend to reflect the skills needed for effective strategic planning. One of those skills is a formal writing style with a high degree of detail that reflects a high degree of analytical thought. Most of the kind of writing we tend to do in our everyday lives these days tends not to be very formal. It can often have very general ideas. It can use phrases such as step up to the plate or various vernacular that we tend to adopt. We all know what it means and it's very effective for what it is. In a formal piece of writing, all that needs to go. It needs to be very simple and understandable, but it also needs to be very detailed and accurate. And the way that we develop that writing is firstly through practice, through the use of English language in written form as frequently as possible. But also what comes really before that is the ability to think very precisely. So I'm going to try and encourage you through all my feedback and through the course notes, through the workbook, to try and be as precise as you can in the way that you're thinking about the analytical issues that we talk about through this class. The other skill that is necessary in strategic planning is forethought. Good strategic planners are visionaries. Strategic plans put down what an organization, how to get an organization from where it is now to where it needs to be in the future. But that, of course, is not in isolation. I mean, no organization is an island, to misquote. So we have environmental issues all around us. Issues that may be to do with budgetary factors, issues to do with employment factors. Sometimes we are not at liberty to take on new employees, even though the workload's increasing. I'm sure that you can all relate to that. All these kinds of things. So there are many external inputs, we call them, into the strategic planning process, and we have to take those into account. This is not an academic piece of writing that we sort of hang on the wall and that's the end of it. A strategic plan is really a working document that is supposed to try and take into account all those things that will impact the future of our organization. As you can see from the previous slide, there are quite a few steps to be taken before you actually start your strategic plan. To start with, you're going to have done a little bit of an inventory of the organization. What are we good at? What are we really what are we known to excel at? What perhaps are we not quite so good at? And then the big question as to where do we want to be? Well, that's very seldom is that one person's vision. That's generally kind of very much more of a committee kind of decision. All of that is part of the whole strategic planning process. And then we get involved in developing the plan itself. And the plan itself will have be quite specific. I mean, strategic plans need to be very detailed. Sometimes there's a separate document associated with it that will actually be talking about who does what. And that's not a bad thing if this is a complex organization. Your plan has to have a process within it that involves monitoring how it is proceeding, how the organization is traveling along its plan. And that monitoring process really needs to have some quantification. There has to be a measure for some of this stuff. Not necessarily everything. Some aspects of your plan are not going to lend themselves to that. Others probably will. If part of your plan as a law enforcement agency was to reduce certain types of crime in your area, then that is quantifiable. And one of the most important things, and this is often omitted from strategic plans and even academic strategic planning models, one of the most important things in my view is that there is a feedback loop from the end of the plan to the beginning of the plan. And when I say the end of the plan, I don't mean that this feedback loop doesn't come into play until the last day of your 10-year planning period. What it means is, as you're going along, if you find that, for instance, if let's just say, for instance, you had one of your goals was to reduce the time taken between arraignment and trial in your court system for 3 different types of court. And you found as you were going along that the family court really was working extraordinarily well, that things, the time was being reduced quite dramatically. However, when you got to one of the other parts of the court system, that didn't seem to be so successful. That information gets fed back to the beginning of the plan. So, okay, this is really working very nicely for one part of the system. What is it about the plan that we need to modify in order to make it work for all parts of our systems? I mean, maybe in a law enforcement agency, if you were trying to reduce the level of crimes against children, let's say drug consumption among youth, and spousal violence, and your plan over the next 10 years, you wanted to see a reduction in that, and you were bold enough to try and quantify what you thought that reduction might be. Maybe another state has produced figures that have said they've managed to reduce crime in some of those areas by certain specific amounts, and you say, okay, well, let's have a look at what they did, let's try and emulate some of that, and let's build that into our strategic plan. So, and then at the end of the day, you find that as you're going along through the plan, maybe one of these objectives is really lagging behind. So you use that information in a feedback mechanism to go back to the beginning of the plan and say, okay, let's revisit the plan, let's fine tune it, let's see how this goes. So I want to get over to you that this evaluation process is extremely important, not just for a big patting on the back, champagne bubbling exercise at the end of the plan because you got there, but as a really positive way in which the progress of your plan can be used as an ongoing basis. In so many different ways, if we're planning something and we, as we're going along, we think, that's not working as well as I thought it would, what can I do? And then you fine tune it and fine tune it and fine tune it. And then at the end of the day, you really have a system which is very efficient. But you only do that by making these little changes and finding what works best for you. Here we can see part of the pre-plan is to gather all the information that we possibly can regarding our organization. We can deem some of this to be irrelevant at some later stage, but it's critical really to try and get as complete a picture as you can of everything to do with your organization, the skills you have, the way you operate, as well as, of course, budgetary factors, number of people involved, what the median age of those personnel are going to be. How will that change in 10 years? Have you got young people coming in to replace older people retiring? Will that change the demographic in any way? Have a look at how the demographic of your area is going to change. We all know that there's going to be a demographic change in the US over the next 20 to 30 years. And the extent of that is really a little bit unknown, but have a look at how the demographic in your particular region may be affected by the passage of time. In terms of age, I mean, might it become more of a retirement-based community? In terms of ethnicity, in terms of whether perhaps, well, we know, for instance, in Reno, we've got Tesla moving in. Is that going to be a little bit of a trend? Are you going to have an environment where you perhaps have a significant number of large organizations that are outside of the gambling or mining communities? That may have an impact on your organization. Very difficult to know which of those facts is going to be very, very important. And you don't have to know that right now, but any information that you can get your hands on regarding external inputs as well as internal facts is very, very useful. The next level, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. Once again, very difficult to assess in any significant degree. But if you were able to go to key personnel in your organization, as well as line staff from all, and just do a brief survey. What do you think we're good at? What do you think we're bad at? That can produce some quite interesting results. What are going to be threats to the way that your organization works? In the law enforcement environment, I'm not sure in the mid-90s if terrorism was going to be considered to be a major threat. I know that when the first terrorist-proof federal courthouse was built, it was done so with a lot of forethought. I mean, at that time there hadn't been really invasions from outside the US. We'd had the McVeigh terrorist attack, but we hadn't had really any significant amount of what we now think of as terrorism. So somebody there was really quite visionary to invest in that extra degree of protection based on really a relatively small sample there. So how are the threats of the next 10 years going to impact your organization, and what are the opportunities going to be? Would you have thought sort of 15 years ago that social media might be a significant communication path for law enforcement agencies? That's an opportunity that was not necessarily easy to spot. There may be others like it. Gather inputs from stakeholders, company performance analysis of your organization. Well, the inputs from stakeholders is really a vital part of the whole process. And not necessarily stakeholders in the sense of the governors or that kind of thing. Stakeholders in this particular case can be extended to other organizations that you depend on or that depend on you. In other words, any kind of organization or group of people or category of people that depend on you or you depend on. Getting their input is a very important factor. Internal and external limitations are obviously critical. We all work to budgets, not as if you can catch a few more criminals in a law enforcement agency and expect to get more money for it. So we have a lot of different limitations than perhaps might be, or certainly different ones that might exist sort of in the, as it were, private sector. So external limitations are going to be, budgetary issues, that kind of thing. Internal limitations are going to be there is a limit to the amount we can change the way that we request people to work. I mean, there are union agreements in place, this kind of thing. And there is a limit to the extent to which we can exchange communication with other agencies. Often the very important aspects of that are covered, but there may be things in your plan that where you'd like to enhance interagency communication, and you have to check whether the internal limitations that you're bound by actually permit that. Social and economic trends, I kind of got ahead of myself there. We'd already really discussed that in terms of a change of demographic in the area that your organization services.